You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. If homesteading sounds like something long outdated from Little House on the Prairie, join me today for a different perspective on how we can nourish our lives. This episode contains adult subject matter and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore how modern homesteading can enhance our well-being no matter where we live. Our guest shares how discovering homesteading and fermentation transformed her perspective, revealing that we can experience the satisfaction of connected living even in small spaces or busy city environments. Elizabeth Bruckner is the author of The Homesteader Mindset, a book that will transform the way you view self-sufficiency and give you the tools and practical tips needed for a more meaningful life. Elizabeth's book has quickly become a must-read for every person who dreams of creating sustainable living through traditional skills and common sense. Her book outlines mental health principles that she has used for over a decade in her acupuncture practice. In 2020, Elizabeth started growing her own food in the suburbs of Los Angeles. She went from black thumb to permaculture passion in a matter of months. She still takes delight in the ability to grocery shop in her own backyard. Her aim is to show you how you can too. Through research and experimentation, she taught herself to compost kitchen scraps, ferment like an alchemist, cook traditional food, and live a life that is more connected than she ever thought possible. Regarded as the fermentation maven, she speaks to enthusiastic crowds on topics such as healing herbs in the kitchen, the power of a toxic-free home, gut-friendly cuisine, and of course, the art of lactofermentation. She holds a Master of Science in Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. Her area of expertise is glowing mental health. She empowers her patients utilizing the 5-element theory of traditional Chinese medicine and the power of habit creation. Elizabeth's groundbreaking methods in self-development for the mind and body have been incorporated by a wide spectrum of budding homesteaders and wellness seekers. Let's meet Elizabeth Bruckner. Hi, Elizabeth. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because modern homesteading for well-being is definitely a curious topic for our conversation today. And I have to be honest, we haven't spoken about this before on the podcast, so I'm doubly excited to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Petra. I am honored that I'm your first official homesteader on your podcast.
Yeah. Oh, that's so amazing. I think it's something that we can all use a little bit more of in our lives. But when we say homesteading, I feel like people often get very complicated ideas, complex ideas, and then they get kind of scared off. And we don't have the time, we don't have this or that. So I'm really glad that you're here today and we can dive into this a little bit and maybe dispel some of those myths and make this really accessible for people. And of course, we'll get into more of that as we start our episode. For starters, would you like to share maybe a little bit about yourself, the part of your story or journey that maybe connects to what you do today, and also share with our listeners what it is that you do today?
Thank you. Well, I'm Elizabeth Bruckner. I'm the author of The Homesteader Mindset, Build a Sustainable Life Wherever You Are. I'm also an acupuncturist with a master's degree in acupuncture and Oriental medicine. I became an accidental homesteader after the pandemic, and we can talk about that story in a bit. I have an absolute love of learning all new things. I have a very curious nature, and when I learn things that I find valuable, I love to teach them. That is why I wrote this book. I love that you're mentioning the misconceptions about homesteading, and I'm sure we'll get into those because there are so many different spokes to the wheel, and there are so many different definitions of homesteading.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. And I think it depends maybe also a little bit of where you live in the world, what people
Mhm.
understand under homesteading. So share a little bit about what made you want to actually get into homesteading after the pandemic. Was there something in particular? I mean, some people come to homesteading because they feel that our diet and our lifestyle doesn't really support well-being in the greatest sense anymore. And some people are just very curious about it. What brought you to homesteading?
That's a great question. I think that my background is kind of like my life has been a bunch of different puzzle boxes, and I've taken a piece of a puzzle out of each box and put it together into this amazing movie. And that seems to be how homesteading has happened upon me. When I first started homesteading, we'll back it up a little bit. I was raised by a mother who is a war refugee from Belarus. And so my grandmother, my grandfather, and all of her siblings came over via Ellis Island, and they were indentured servants for a farming community. And what happens is a lot of times the farm or the business would pay for the ticket, and then you couldn't really get out of the service because you had to pay rent and you were constantly going in debt. A church, Russian Orthodox church, paid their debt, and then they were invited to the East Coast to join a community. So I say all of this because this is where I started. I started with being around people where English is a second language, where there's this strong cultural tie to some motherland that I had never been to and didn't quite know. I'm Belarusian, but quite honestly, they would always say Russian because everybody spoke Russian. So I had Czechoslovakian aunts, and I had an uncle from Ukraine and an uncle from Germany, but we all happened to speak Russian. My family were a bunch of immigrants. And so they stayed together. They kind of stuck together and created that community. I didn't know that other parts of America didn't have that. I didn't know that there wasn't this. We had a Russian American club where all of the aunts and uncles would get together and they knew me and I knew their cousins, and we'd be out barefoot running through fields and having fun. And I didn't know that didn't exist elsewhere. So it was a small town in a rural community, but it was connected by this one spoken language and a similar like Slavic culture. With that being said, I had heard whispered, hushed stories about famine, war, scarcity. And the fun fact that I've been talking about lately is when your mother was in your grandmother's womb as a formed fetus, your egg, the egg that created you, was in her ovaries. I've been in my grandmother's womb, and so have all of us. So when we talk about family tragedy or DNA or kind of family history that's stored in the cells, it truly is stored in the cells. When she had cortisol because a Russian soldier held a gun up to her, or her farm was taken by the government by Stalin, those are things that actually affected the beginning of what my body was. And I think that happens with a lot of people in different multiculturals. It is important to know where our history is. All of that, then I was a Gen X. Was I a Gen X? I was a Gen X in America, which means growing up with stores that always have food on the shelves, and the layaway was a big thing. Now they have credit cards, but back then you could like buy a shirt and pay $1 per week to get that shirt later, which was great for a teenager. So I was raised with a strong work ethic, and my mother and father bought into the American dream, which is work a lot of hours, sometimes 60 to 80 hours a week. I was raised basically, my brother and myself, after school, we were just off to ourselves, lots of processed foods, lots of microwave, because my mom really honestly didn't have time. There was inside children, like my two aunts would do the cooking and the sewing with my grandmother. And then there were two outside children that would help with the farming. My mom helped with the farming. So she really didn't have a knack for kitchen. So I was raised that you just don't cook. You just process food. You outsource the production of your food. You outsource the consumption of your food. So I'm getting homemade meals from healthy restaurants. Now we're fast forwarding to my 30s, and I'm drawn to holistic medicine because I know that what Western medicine was giving me wasn't working. I was given antibiotics like candy as a child, like every season. Perhaps I had asthma back then and it just was undiagnosed, but I did have chronic bronchitis. And so they just kept giving me medication that was killing my gut microbiome, which was causing depression and unstable immune system. Like it was a mess. But I didn't know any of that. I just knew I didn't feel comfortable with what was happening. Like the white coats weren't helping me and I didn't know why. And then I bumped into my husband and he was already holistically minded. And we started experimenting with herbs to cure my chronic bronchitis. And we did. Now, at that point, I was not a holistic practitioner, nor was my husband. And so we used herbs in a balanced way, and it caused me to have some side effects. So I don't often talk about those herbs. I think that it's important to really educate yourself in terms of making sure that your body's balanced. For example, what I was using was bringing heat to my lungs, and that was too much heat for my heart. Then I decided to go into acupuncture because I want a stable and fulfilling job. And I took a year just interviewing lots of different healthcare practitioners. And the reason I bumped into acupuncture is because it was like, I can put a needle in someone until I'm 80. Because at the time I was like 30. I know I wasn't a young whippersnapper. I needed to have a profession that I could do for many years. During my first decade of an acupuncturist, I started spiraling into fatigue and illness. And I didn't understand why. I was eating a healthy vegetarian diet. And I will say healthy in air quotes because it was a lot of processed foods, lots of seed oils. And I slowly slipped into a very chronic illness that became debilitating and scary. From the Chinese medical perspective, I was just a few steps away from coma in terms of what my pulse was looking like and the symptoms that were happening. The doctors were mystified. I really wanted to get a diagnosis, a Western diagnosis that I could treat with acupuncture. And instead, I got about 7 different diagnoses from the 7 different doctors that I went to. So all this is leading up to homesteading because at this point, I'm now too ill. I'm bedbound for weeks, homebound for months. And about the time that I'm homebound for months, I'm like, I'd like to start bringing some nutrient-dense food and kind of singing. I want to be a useful part of this family that I'm in, because for weeks, I was just unable to do anything and had to make a decision. I started to decide that I was going to learn how to ferment food because I understood that fermentation from biological aspect. When you ferment vegetables, for instance, the vitamin content increases tremendously and the bioavailability, which means your body's ability to intake those vitamins increases tremendously. And then there's all these happy little microbes, these beneficial bacteria that are going to help clean up the wasteland that was my gut that caused a lot of the chronic illness to begin with from the overuse of antibiotics. I slowly started dipping my toe into it. And luckily, through language learning, which was my first hobby for pleasure, I learned a great deal about how I like to learn and the types of habits that can be created, that you can learn something tremendously in relatively quick time just by immersing yourself in little tiny 5-minute sessions. So I started doing that with this thing that I didn't know what it was called, like vegetable fermentation, growing your own food. At that time, there was no name for it. And then the pandemic hit. And we live in the suburbs of Southern California, lots of concrete, lots of sidewalks, lots of telephone poles, not a lot of land. And I remember going to the grocery store, and it was almost like my DNA from my grandmother's era, from the wartime era, turned on because the shelves were empty. They had taken the produce section and cut it in half, never to come back again. And this was a health food store. And there was no garlic and ginger to be found. And that was very important because we had this issue with a respiratory illness going around. Garlic and ginger are 2 of the best things that you can do for healing respiratory in Chinese medicine. So I came home and I was panicked and said, what are we going to do? We don't know where our food's coming from. Like, we have a broken food system. This was 2020 is when I was realizing this in my 40s. And my husband said, why don't we try growing our own food? And I'm like, do you know who I am? Like, have you seen what I've done to our plants in the backyard? Right now, behind me, Petra, you see plants that never existed in the house before. Like I just didn't know what I didn't know. So I started going to the garden store and saying, can you please help me grow food in the backyard? And they would give me like one thing and then I'd kill it and then I'd come back. I killed a lot of plants during this learning period. And then I thought I learned a lot about language learning on YouTube. What if I learn about gardening and fermentation on YouTube? And that is when I bumped into these people that were calling themselves homesteaders. And I'd like to get into the definition because there's several, but I was like, what is homesteading? Is that like Little House on the Prairie and you make your own clothes and you have absolutely no electricity and your nearest neighbor is 5 miles away? Well, yes, that was originally homesteading. In the early Americas, we had something called the Homesteading Acts around 1862, where the government was granting 270 million acres to private landowners. So that is where you get the 40 acres of mule stuff that was happening. But now, homesteading is just a practice of cultivating resilience through a more intentional way of living. So it's a more meditative, more still, more quiet, more healing lifestyle. And this involves reducing toxic load in our homes, building our gut microbiomes with nutrient-dense food, growing edible landscaping, and connecting more deeply with our own innate resourcefulness, because I think we've forgotten that we have it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording. It was like this great revelation that there's this new wave of living and eating. But in reality, we're just coming back to roots, to things our ancestors were already doing. And I'm really glad that you gave us a bit of a definition here, because I do think a lot of people conjures up this image of when you're homesteading that you have to give up sort of everything that you're doing. You have to give up your creature comforts. You have to give up your job because you have to do this now all day long, morning to night, because you have to tend a farm, you have to tend animals. In reality, that's not really necessary at all. You can be homesteading in a sense that you, I would say, ameliorate your life and your well-being and still be part of a modern life. And of course, all the things that you're used to, hopefully minus the processed foods and toxic cleaning agents and all of those kind of things. But it is possible to do this. You are living this way at the moment. You're a glowing example of that. So it is possible for busy people to become homesteaders in whatever container is possible for them, and where they're living and what their life looks like. And I think even when you own just a small apartment or you have very small space, you could have a balcony garden, or you could do things in your home, do some herbs in the home or things like that, right? You could even be part of a community garden if that's available in your town. So I do think this myth of that we have to really return, like you said, to the Little House on the Prairie to make our own clothes and give everything up, that is, to me, a very unrealistic way of looking at homesteading. And I do think that homesteading is such a fantastic step into our own health and vitality again. I love that you explained that. I love it in that sense. So hopefully our listeners at this point are going, okay, maybe this is something I can actually do and I can look at as well. And I can still keep electricity and flowing water and everything else.
Yes, you can have toilets that flush for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that people don't realize, and this is where my medical background and homesteading came hand in hand. This is where the puzzle pieces from the different boxes come, which is I have a lot of patients that want to live healthier lifestyles, but their biggest concern is I don't have time. I do not have time. And what I say is find a spoke of the homesteading wheel. Maybe it's fermenting vegetables. Maybe it's growing one tomato plant in your backyard, or herbs. Herbs are the gateway drug to gardening because they're perennials, which means you don't have to plant them once and you're good to go. They're easy and it's like high quality. And a little bunch of rosemary can cost $5 in a grocery store. But if you plant it once, water it enough, you can clip it. It continues to grow like a bush. You never run out of rosemary and you're saving $5 every time you go out there. You do it in ways that are super easy. The other thing that I would mention in terms of this concept of we don't have time, because that's, I think, what a lot of listeners like, this sounds great, Elizabeth, and kudos to you for feeling better, but I don't have time. And what I will say is if I can do it when I was homebound, so debilitated that I really, when I say homebound, it wasn't like I was puttering in the house all the time. I had maybe 5 minutes of energy to get up and do something. And that would involve taking some salt water, putting vegetables in it, like carrots, putting a lid on it, and then every day opening that lid twice a day. And that was my fermentation. And seeing it bubble. Ferment actually comes from the Latin root. Ferment is to boil. Those little bubbles, that's how you know. You kind of listen. It's like snap, crackle, pop. You listen to it, it's doing good. And then in 4 days, you have this incredibly nutrient dense food. That's something you can do when you wash the dishes. Everybody's got to wash the dishes. That's something you can do after you're done brushing your teeth. You go out, you create this 5-minute vegetable routine, and yet it's direct medicine in your home. And what I loved about us talking earlier before the podcast was talking about our grandmothers and that they were doing this stuff. I didn't know until I wrote this book. My mom was talking about raw milk and how useful it is. And now how I culture my milk, I make it with kefir, and that eats up lots of candida, and it's very anti-cancer. It's amazing. And my mom's like, oh yeah, grandma used to have a cow and your brother was raised on raw milk. And I'm like, how did we never talk about this? But it's because it's very recent history, but it can be forgotten. And when you talk about your family and having jars of herbs, that is what my kitchen looks like. It's so easy to make medicinals simply by adding honey to them or adding alcohol to them, like a little vodka with some herbs soaking in it will make like elderberry syrup. So easy. I think I haven't made elderberry syrup. I made elderberry tinctures, which is the king of herbs. In terms of American folklore, it's the herb that's great for all sorts of colds and flus. And all I had to do was buy the berries, stick them in a certain amount of vodka for 6 weeks in a dark place, and that was it. Then I had a tincture. Like it's that easy. That takes maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah. And I feel that this can be done as a family too. So if you're thinking we don't have time, everyone was involved in this back in the day. So it wasn't just grandmas, right? The parents were involved, the kids were involved. It's like, okay, go and get this from the garden, or you peel this and you take these jars. So I feel like this could also be a real nice activity for getting children involved with knowing about their food again and getting that experience of what happens when we pick this or we peel this or we ferment this, right? What happens? I feel this is really interesting for everyone in the family. It can create also the sense of community again, which I feel has been sadly lost in many families and in many communities in the world, where we can have that shared experience over food again, and we can have a healing experience over food again as well. And the benefits of those, you've touched on some of them: chronic illness, you've mentioned cancer, you've mentioned debilitating illness that you suffered from. And there are a lot of those stories that I hear from people who are going back to the roots and who are going more from a homesteading perspective. And of course, Western medicine has its place. You break your foot and you go get an x-ray and a cast, and there's place for all of that. But there are many things before we come to Western medicine that we can do to take care of ourselves and to preventatively even take care of ourselves before antibiotics are necessary or anything like that. So I love that. And my grandma was a big believer in all of those things. We had honey and onion cough syrups, and we had elderberry syrup when we had a flu in the wintertime, got added to hot water, or she made a soup with it. And she pickled and fermented all sorts of things in the garden so that you could have vegetables all winter long because they weren't in season. So you used what you had in your cellar. I feel this is a really healthy way of living and coming back into the natural seasons where not everything is available at all times during the year. It's meant to be like that. In the wintertime, the earth is resting, it's regenerating. So that's when we rely on the things that we have canned and pickled and brined. And that's a good way, I feel like, of living with those seasons and living with nature. And we can do that in a sort of modern container that we live in now. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And what are some of your favorite things? So you mentioned fermenting. What are some of the favorite things that you love doing when you are homesteading? And maybe some tips for our listeners on easy things that they could start with, just integrating into their lives?
That's a great question. And I do want to also mention that you mentioned this idea of community. I would venture to say that we have a systemically ill community. The community itself, the power of community needs to be nurtured. And one of the ways is often when I have friends and family over for dinner, there'll be a lull in the conversation and I'll say something like, who wants to help me collect seeds? And you would not believe how excited people get. And then they mention it like 6 months later. Remember when we collect seeds? And I'm like, yeah, I just needed some extra hands. But they love, there's something very mindful and settling and connecting you to the earth where we're supposed to be. Like, again, you're not only outsourcing your food, you're outsourcing your happiness. Because when I'm sitting with my cousin and we're collecting parsley seeds, number one, she's for the first time in her life touching a parsley seed. And then she's realizing that this one parsley plant made millions of seeds, and the abundance, like this idea that there's not enough food, there's an abundance. Nature is so generous. So that's the first part of healing the community. I love this. And having your kids, there have been studies that show that picky eaters, kids that have trouble with different textures or are not eating vegetables, when they start growing their own food in school gardens or in family gardens, they are more likely to try the food and start eating it. Is it because they're connected to it? I don't know. Is it their natural curiosity? I don't know. But their bodies start to crave it, and then they start eating real food. I want to do this kind of in a spectrum, because growing food sounds really scary to some people, right? And in my book, I talk about a woman in her 20s that lives in an urban area and how she starts growing food, a family in the suburbs and a family in a rural area. Because sometimes you live in a rural area and you still don't know what to do with your land. And if you're in an urban area, the first thing you can do, and I would recommend this for suburbs and rural too, is start visiting your farmer's market and get to know your farmers. I would say that 80 to 90% of the food that I buy, my grocery store is my farmer's market. I usually stop at the grocery store on the way home to get milk because we don't have a nearby dairy farm. But everything else, my sourdough bread, which I don't bake because it's a spoke of the wheel that I'm not interested in. I have a baker there that does 48-hour ferment. And all of my farmer friends know my name and I know their name. And it's because I said, hi, I'm Elizabeth. What's your name? And thank you so much for feeding my family. And then week after week after week, I am building a community simply by showing up. That is something you can do. And when you do that, I remember when I used to go to the big box grocery stores, I would have to look at the chalkboard to see what was in season. Like they had to tell me what was in season. Because again, I was so disconnected. When you've gone to the farmer's market season after season after season, I'm lucky that we do all 4 seasons here. Like, oh, apples are getting low. It's not going to be okay. Berries are coming soon. This is pretty exciting. Oh, I got to get the squash now before there's no more squash. You become more connected to what's going to happen. So that's the first thing. That's an easy, just start shopping at the farmer's market and just see how much you can buy there in terms of your food. And there's a lot of them that even have programs for like food stamps. You can get food at the farmer's market, which is fantastic. And that's mind blowing. The second thing that I absolutely love, as I've been called the fermentation maven because I love fermentation. One of my favorite ferments is honey ginger. So I take ginger and I just crunch it up, or you can grate it. You put it in honey and then you close the jar, and then you just every day, like a lava lamp, you turn it. And eventually the ginger starts tasting like honey. The honey starts tasting like ginger. And if you take just a dollop, this is how I wow people. I do that. I put a few peppercorns in to give it just a little bit of bottom. And then when people come to visit, I'll have a little bit of my fermented kefir cream, which also takes 5 minutes. You put kefir in a jar of milk or cream and you let it sit for 2 days, and then you have kefir cream. No cooking involved. No stir. I really am a fan of 3 steps or less when it comes to being in the kitchen, which is why I don't can. Instead, I ferment, and that's kind of like canning. I will do a little dab of the cream, or maybe 2 spoons of the cream, and I'll put a little bit of the honey ginger on it. And people are like, oh my, what? How did you do this? And it's just your body really loves good food. Like real food tastes really delicious. And a fun fact about honey, because I never understood, how are we fermenting stuff in honey, right? Because honey's antiseptic, antifungal, antiviral. It turns out when honey touches any sort of water, hydrolysis, it has a yeast that wakes up, and that yeast then ferments the stuff in it. So your honey onions that your grandma was making, there's a yeast in the honey. It's taking the water out of the onion and it's fermenting. And so it's creating more microorganisms. Another thing that I love to do for those that are cooks is ferment garlic. So you take garlic and you put it in salt water for a couple of days. The thing that I love about fermented garlic is it's a more garlicky taste, which is crazy because I love garlic. But also now when you're going to make something and it calls for garlic, you don't have to peel it. It's just in your fridge for weeks. And fermented garlic is so adaptive that really scary bacteria, the antibiotic resistant bacteria like MRSA, they actually don't know how to fight fermented garlic, and fermented garlic can kill those scary things. So that's really a nice thing to keep on hand. And everything that I just mentioned now, aside from the farmer's market, takes about 5 minutes or less to do.
Yeah. Wow. I love those things. And thank you for diving into that a little bit and explaining that. I feel like we're also touching here on some of the food safety, because when people hear fermented or pickled or brined or this or that and not cooked as we are used to, there may be some concerns about how safe is this to put this in our body? Is this safe to consume, or can this make us ill? So I'm glad you're touching on this a little bit, because it sounds like processes are happening that make this safe to consume, and we don't need to boil it to death or pasteurize it or anything like that. How does the food safety work when we are homesteading and we are doing a lot of these things over a longer period of time? And I mean, we can do this with meat too. Right now we're talking about vegetables, but of course a lot of this gets done with meat as well. So what does the food safety look like from that perspective, maybe considering some of our listeners who might be concerned about that?
This is such a great question. And as an American, I really grew up in be as sterile as possible. I was a hand sanitizer fan because that's what I was taught. You have to get rid of those germs. Those germs are bad business. It turns out that what's really working on your terrain, if your terrain is strong, which in Chinese medicine would be if your defensive qi is strong, then a lot of those microbes stay in line. Now, here's another fun fact. There are more microorganism cells in your body than there are human cells. That's crazy. So that being said, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to help the good guys and tell the ones that are imbalanced that they need to stay in line. When you have fermentation out on the counter, one of the most important tools that you have, a tool that will save your life, is your nose. If something smells funky, and it's not like a funky cheese funky, it's like your carrots smell really bad or moldy, those are not carrots that you want to eat. You need to throw them out. Typically, though, the salt in the water, and I do one type of salt for everything, which means I typically have very salty ferments, because they can say if it has a higher sugar content, you can do less salt or blah, blah, blah. I do 2 cups of water for 1 tablespoon of salt. And that way I don't have to remember anything else. That's all I knew. But what happens is the salt in there is actually inhibiting the bacterias that are going to break down the food and create mold and fungus and all that stuff. And the lactobacillus, which is a microorganism that is already on the vegetables, it starts to thrive in that environment. In my many years of fermenting, I've never had a ferment that I've had to throw out. However, what you're looking for, if you're going to be concerned, is you're looking for colorful mold. If the mold is like a fancy color, it needs to go. If the mold is something called calming yeast, which is a little bit white and it's just like a thin layer on the top, you can just mix it into the food. Calming yeast is actually quite beneficial, or you can scrape it off the top. Now, with my sauerkraut, which I can ferment, the longest ferment I've done so far is 7 months. I put it in a big, gigantic jar and I throw an unchopped up cabbage leaf over it, because sauerkraut is cabbage, for those of you that don't know. I put it in the food processor, and then I put this cabbage leaf and I push it down so that it's under the brine. And in 7 months, that cabbage leaf is not pretty. It doesn't smell, but it's not good looking. So I take that cabbage leaf off, I lift it off, and usually there's this beautiful, very fermented, which means highly digested, right? Because those microorganisms are eating that food for you. So now your stomach doesn't have to do a second digestion. It's so much easier to go through. And that's why a lot of doctors, and I specifically, recommend that with every meal have some sort of fermentation, real fermentation, just a spoon. Because in 1 teaspoon of sauerkraut, for instance, there are more probiotics, live probiotics, than there are in a 68 bottle of the fancy probiotics that you buy at the supermarket. That's unheard of, like an entire bottle. So you want to be careful, because it's medicine. You want to be careful how you dose. Always start low and slowly increase. But once your body's good, have it with every meal and it will be tremendously helpful. Now, with that being said, there are a few things, like I've heard of people doing garlic in olive oil, which is very good. And if it's not stored properly, that could be a little tricky, because olive oil is a fat and fats can go rancid. So you have to be careful there. I've never done that. I usually just infuse other things with my garlic and then I put it into the salad dressing, etc. But does that answer your question about the scary stuff? Like, what should we do if there's something scary?
Yeah, no, I think that answers it very beautifully. And hopefully our listeners are getting the sense that this is a safe way to nourish your body. We just think about things like sauerkraut or kimchi or any of these fermented things that we do eat and that are really good for us. And then we don't need to actually take probiotics in a pill because we are feeding our bodies the things that it needs. Now, I do think that obviously we need to pay attention to that we're using clean jars or we are using clean utensils and things like that when we start fermentation. But there are many things that have mold on them, like kinds of cheeses and kinds of meats that are perfectly safe to consume if it's done in the right way. So, yeah, thank you for explaining that. And I'm guessing your book probably also has some of those instructions in it and to let people know how they can start with these processes and make sure that they're using the right tools and the right containers and getting this done in a safe way for themselves.
Yeah, the book talks a lot about creating the mindset because I think people think that this is like, as we're talking, someone here is going, oh my gosh, honey ginger sounds delicious. And that was not hard. You chop up ginger and put it in honey. What I'm teaching people in the book through story, because it's 3 different families that we follow, is how you can find the thing that you love, which I'll give you the tip right now is start daydreaming. Give yourself 5 minutes for a week to daydream about what sounded really good in this episode. For me, I would have been the honey ginger because I have a sweet tooth. I've been like, how do I make honey ginger? Or the fact that I mentioned, are you guys ready for this? Fermented kefir cream ice cream, which is fantastic. I wanted people to know how to start, but there are so many spokes. I wanted them to know what the roadmap was to getting to something closer. So it starts with daydreaming and then it goes with tiny little habits that build on success. You work a lot with functional freeze. And I wanted to find a way that people could get out of that functional freeze and start creating successes that they can then build their inspiration, their motivation, and also their sense of esteem. It is possible for me to do this. I used to say, I'm not a cook. I would even still say I'm not a cook, but I can create incredible meals, nutrient dense meals in less than 20 minutes because I taught myself how to harness that little tiny bit of traditional homesteading that is now becoming modern homesteading in my daily life. I'm really grateful that you're talking about these things and allowing us to be more excited about them and not so much inundated and overwhelmed. That is not the message that I'm giving. The message that I'm giving is there's lots of hope. It starts with a little bit of gratitude. Like I'm super excited about the opportunities that we have available to us. Running water really helps in modern homesteading. Like these tools are amazing and we get to use them and we get to harken back to the amazing wisdom that our ancestors had.
Yeah. And I guess dishwashers are a good thing too.
Oh, yes. God bless my dishwasher.
Yeah, because my grandma used to have this stove that you had to throw coal briquettes into to heat it. So I do appreciate a lot of the modern things that have come along to make homesteading a little bit more accessible for us. So yeah. So listeners, if you're curious about this and there is definitely a starting point, your farmers markets, or if there aren't farmers markets in your area, maybe you have an organic store that deals with local farmers, or you can even find some people online that might be doing their kefir. I think there were some communities that I even found here that give away kefir grains and things like that. So I think there are lots of opportunities to connect, to start dipping your toes into this. And Elizabeth, in addition to your book, and let us know what your book is called also, do you have any other programs or services available and ways that our listeners could connect with you?
My book is called The Homesteader Mindset, Build a Sustainable Life Wherever You Are, and it's available on Amazon or anywhere you get books. I am currently, speaking of kefir, I am currently creating an online course about the medical benefits of kefir and how to dose properly, how to create it. It's a deep dive. It's a masterclass on kefir. And so I'm about 3/4 of the way done, and that will be up on my website very soon. And then I'm going to go into meat stock, and then I'm going into fermenting veggies. All of these things that take maybe 10 minutes or less, but seem incredible, seem like you have to outsource when you don't. And then lastly, I do have a gift for your audience, Petra. It's a daily habit tracker. It's a homestead habit tracker. And what it has is not only just a cute little graphic that you can use for tracking your new habits, but it also gives you tips on how to create very minimal yet life-changing habits based on just 1 to 3 minutes a day. And once you build on those successes, then you can come and tell me how fantastic it was, and we can continue to build more. The way that you can get that habit tracker is by going to my website, www.createwellnessproject.com/gift, GIFT. And then if you want to come see me and say hello, there's a contact page on createwellnessproject.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that and for your very generous gift. And listeners, please go look at our show notes where we'll be linking to all of Elizabeth's offerings. Make sure that you get the free gift and find some ways that you can integrate this into your life. Some easy, simple ways to start off with, build those habits. And when you feel confident in the little things that you've done, add one more thing, try another thing. And I feel that you'll get to a point where this will seem doable and you will start craving these flavors, these good foods, these, as Elizabeth called them, medicines that are really supporting your body, which is a very different experience than just picking up a frozen pizza and throwing it in the oven. I feel like when you eat clean like that and you do homesteading, there is more texture, there are more colors, the flavors burst, and it is an entirely different experience. So I do hope that our listeners get to have that experience in their own lives. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining me today and sharing this wisdom with our listeners. And again, we will be connecting to all of your offerings in the show notes, and hopefully you will see some of our listeners in your masterclasses, workshops, and upcoming things that you have. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for sharing.
Petra, it's been a joy. Thank you for radiating such kindness and opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much. I think we have to keep talking about these things that are life-changing and that really are so much more simple than we sometimes make them out to be in our heads, because they can be a little bit daunting. As you said, when we say growing food, people are imagining fields and tractors and all sorts of things. I like the idea that we are making things a lot more accessible for people and showing that there are options out there to support your own well-being in very simple ways in your life. So thank you so much for that, Elizabeth, and take really great care of yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.